for being here. I think I know everybody here, so it's nice to have you here. I don't have to tell you where the bathrooms are or anything like that. Just so you know, the show runs until August 5th, so if you want to keep coming back, please do, or you can tell people about the show. And we're just going to have this be sort of a pretty casual dialogue with Michael and Roy. I want to start out just by talking about, when I was getting prepared for this, I looked at, in my artist statement that I've had for years, the first line is, at the heart of my work is a desire to find the intersection of art and design. It's been something I have been working towards and is part of my own personal mission. So this show really resonates with me, and is why we're having him here today. And I'm really glad to have Michael and Roy here. For me, you know, this combination of art and design is inseparable. It's a hand in glove situation. And you know, you look back at all the great masters, Renaissance masters, you know, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Dante and all those guys. If you look at their work, you start breaking down, incredible designers, right? And the interesting part is that they were all work for hire. They were working for clients, be it the church or wealthy patrons, and you know, and site-specific problems that they were trying to solve, whether it was a church altar or a chapel ceiling. You could argue that Michelangelo might be the most famous freelance commercial artist of all time. But, you know, some people don't like that. This show features Michael and Roy, and I love their work because it's really a convergence of their backgrounds as designers. Roy's an architect, Michael's an industrial designer by training, and people sort of worked out on that a little bit professionally. But their work sort of sits perfectly in this convergence of art and design. And that's really the sort of the launch point for me in wanting to pair them together. And I think you've all had a chance to look at her work, and I think it's a really beautiful show. And we're just going to get started, sort of dive into here. I'd like for the both of you to sort of talk about your backgrounds a little bit, how you got your educational backgrounds, your professional backgrounds, and you know, and sort of set the stage for how you got to this body of work. So, Michael, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So, to build on what Paul said, I studied industrial design, which is, some people have heard of that, some people haven't, but it's like product design, right? It's not design of industry, but it's like commercial products, consumer products, and things like that. So in that, there's a lot of drawing, a lot of technical skills and things that I think still come to life because I'm kind of still drawing on a canvas. This is all in the kind of the pre-iPhone era I like to talk about too. Like,
what?
There was no device in our pockets that could do 100 things for us. So like every object that we had and like did one or two things really well, or you hope. And then how it got designed was also really important too, because, well, I mean, there just wasn't one thing that dominated everything else. So I think that's always kind of been a part of how I approach, you know, creative things, like giving form meaning. And the way this body of work sort of came to life was more recently, over the last few years, my career has kind of gone more into management, right? So I'm not practicing design on a daily basis at my job. And so then, you know, my creative practice at home just kind of started to go up and up from there. So, yeah, built most of these pieces over the last year and a half. I work at P&G now, so I do, you know, consumer work for, I mean, right now it's kind of, we do work for like Oral-B toothbrushes and things like that. So it's an interesting thing to do that during the day and then to come home and think about things like this at night. Yeah.
Well, when I was a toddler, I had a proclivity to be left-handed. And my mom, who wasn't really reading a lot of Dr. Spock or whatever in terms of how to rear children, was listening more to her grandmother, who had basically grown up in a kind of immigrant blue-collar family at the turn of the century. And the first thing she said to my mom is, "You've got to fix this, you gotta change it so that he doesn't use his left hand, because he'll never get a job in a factory, he'll never be able to use tools, and he won't be able to make a living. So, years later, when I was a teenager and I decided, by the way, it seemed to have worked. I'm right-handed now for the most part. And so I guess whatever she did, worked. But anyway, by the time I was a teenager, I said I wanted to go to art school, and my mom was like, what else do you want to do? Besides that, so I went to design school. I also studied industrial design for a few years before I decided to go into architecture. And that took me to University of Illinois. Finally, I started out here at UC in industrial design and ended up at University of Illinois. And a mentor professor that I had there kind of steered me toward the program at MIT for graduate school, because ironically enough, it was a very humanist program. Not at all like most of the schools at the Institute. It was very much about kind of how do we design with the human spirit, and using the human spirit at heart.
Left-handedness.
Yeah, so my left-handedness was still somehow, playing a role. So anyway, in terms of art, I was drawing obviously way before I was a designer and before I would have called myself an artist, but drawing has always been at the root of everything I do. And as a designer, it was all about drawing. I drew everything, and then that was my process for solving problems, to the point that when technology kind of came in and decided that we don't really use pencils and pens anymore, we're going to use the digital formats now. I kind of lost interest in a lot of it, or at least I became kind of resistant to a lot of that change. So I see somebody that I used to work with in a design office here, and I remember being the kind of dinosaur that was in the office. And I think my boss, who was a little older than I am, actually appreciated that there was still somebody who was more comfortable with a pencil than a keyboard, and a mouse.
The only guy in the office with a quill pen.
He pretty much had a quill pen. Right. So anyway, that's my story of how I kind of got both into art and design.
It's sort of interesting when you talk about MIT. It's almost like, I think Stanford was the place that sort of ushered in this empathetic design approach.
Well, in Berkeley. Berkeley and MIT were
okay, but it was not a word when we went to design school that they used, but it's interesting how that's come into play as designers, that whole empathy thing, and it sounded like MIT was ahead of the game in some respects, even though maybe they didn't refer to it that way.
Yeah, unfortunately, when I was there, we were on the backside of that wave. It was really a school that had been progressive in the 60s, as you might imagine, because that's when those kind of social values, the kind of socio-political values in architecture were really a thing. And a lot of those professors were still there in the late 80s and early 90s when I was in grad school. So I had the benefit of learning from them before the program kind of shifted dramatically into the tech age.
Were you always drawing as a kid as well, Michael?
Yeah, I remember drawing out of Sports Illustrated magazines, just like athletes and stuff. And for some reason, I would always use a pen. And I think people always were impressed by that. And then it probably fed into it even more, oh yeah, I can draw with a pen or something like that. That's just something, I don't ever remember how it got started, but I just eventually had a sketchbook. And
So those early affirmations of those skill sets, really important into sort of directing you. How old were you when you started getting that kind of notice for your pen drawing and you for your pencil drawing?
I think I remember, but I'm what was I, maybe 8 or 9 or something like that, I guess.
I don't remember when it wasn't always a pencil. It was crayons,
whatever
it was,
you get.
magic markers, whatever. I'd draw with anything,
For me, it was the 3rd grade.
Yeah.
I so specifically remember,
Really?
it was also, oh, okay. I was one of 8 kids, so I was always trying to figure out what was going to be my path. It was okay, I'll take that path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody else is musicians, I'll go this way. So
that's
think about that.
That's how it was. I was always the artist. And get Lloyd to do it. He's the artist.
Yeah.
He can do that.
Yeah.
He can design a t-shirt for us. He can do whatever,
Yep.
You got to grow to where the sun is shining, huh?
Yeah.
And figure out how to get up there.
Yeah.
So
interestingly, I always thought it was going to be the door that opened me up into like the world of, the popular kids and all that, and it's never that, being an artist, you're never going to make it with the popular kids. They might get you to do their t-shirt for them, but, you're not one of them,
So you sort of sound like you both started that way, that ambition or that sort of direction got altered and shifted over into design work, which I think a lot of people it happens because it's a profession and you can make money at it, right?
Yeah.
So it's but were you, as you entered into studying and becoming an adult, was it always there for you that you had that sort of drive to want to find a way to express yourself in another way? And
yeah, I don't ever remember not doing art in some form on my own usually. I never, at the time I was a professional, I wasn't really thinking this is, going to blossom into a career as an artist. But, I always did it. And I think my wife was an architect. We were talking about how when we trained and when we worked as an architect, really in school, we were always told, you're not an artist. Don't forget, designers are not artists.
Yeah,
you're here to solve problems.
Yep.
You're here to collaborate with other designers and clients and everything. And you're here to reach as broad an audience or a market, you would call it in this case, as possible. And don't let your personal ideas and inspirations and stuff get in the way. You're a problem solver. And I don't think that's really quite where things are nowadays. I think it's a lot more open in terms of artists thinking of themselves as designers and designers thinking of themselves as artists. It's a lot freer to kind of move between the two. But yeah, I think in the 80s particularly, what I'm remembering was pretty hardcore,
Oh,
there were a lot of
absolutely.
rules. There were a lot of rules back then about how you do things.
Oh,
So
yeah. It's a very black and white division between art and design, and you see when I went there.
Yeah.
Everybody,
And some
everybody looked at
biases.
each other cross-eyed.
yeah, I mean, artists thought designers were, sellouts, and designers thought artists, were, wasting time basically. They could be doing something a lot more
Yeah.
profitable and useful. Yeah.
Yeah, we sort of like we always joke, the artist would go, I painted it blue because, and designers be like, you have to have an absolute reason why that is blue.
And by the way,
it's that shade of blue.
it's Pantone,
Yeah,
236.
so everything was justified and quantified, and you sort of lost the touch with just free expression because it just felt right. So early on, were you going to art museums as kids? Were your parents take you to art museums, and were you receptive to that?
Yeah, I went to, so I'm from Illinois, I didn't mention that before, so we have some Chicago connections here in the room, but we would go to the Chicago Art Institute like on field trips and stuff. And so you'd be able to see paintings that you had maybe seen in books earlier that year, or something like a Picasso or whatever, like, oh, this is so cool. In person, it looks totally different, or not totally different, but you see more, and you walk down the hallway and you're like, I've seen that in a book before. I didn't know what it was, but apparently it's important, and you walk up to it and learn more about it and stuff like that.
Were there particular artists that were from your childhood, and from those periods of time from earlier on, that you were influenced by or really identified with?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about going to the Art Institute as a kid. I grew up in Indianapolis, and we lived really close to the art museum there. We didn't really go there as a family because my family wasn't particularly that interested in the arts, but I went there a lot in school, on school field trips, so that was cool. And I didn't get to the Art Institute probably till I was in high school. I think we went on a class trip up there. And that's the first time I remember seeing like Mondrian and Cubists and stuff like that. And probably had a lot to do with me going into architecture, I would think. I don't remember specifically saying, oh, this is very architectural, but I do remember loving Mondrian because there was such a purity about the work, and it was so structured and it was so clean. And I don't know, maybe we'll get into this later, but interestingly enough, as I've gone to the Art Institute over the years and looked at these same paintings that I kind of have been seeing all my life, they kind of transformed for me a little bit to the point where the last time I saw the same Mondrian, I realized, it's not just about this kind of precision and purity, but there's a lot of, it's very super painterly, and I actually see that, it wasn't all masked and everything. He didn't get those straight lines from, he was painting them. He had obviously using a straight edge and all that to get things straight. But you could see the brush strokes, you could see some imperfections or I wouldn't even call them imperfections, just like evidence of his hand on it. And then add to that the fact that these paintings are like 100 years old now, and the paint has started to check and crack and discolor in some places, and that became super meaningful to me as like a 60-year-old creative, because I suddenly began to realize that this idea of time and personal history and everything actually is a big part of the work. And so when you look at the stuff I've been doing here, the Mondrian type stuff, you see all these other textures and layers in it, and it's really coming from that realization that it's not, I'm a minimalist at heart, but then I could never just do a black square and call it a day. There's gotta be something inside that square that like takes you to the next level, or brings you back out of it again, or whatever. I want to know that there's another story or many stories in there, and a lot of that's the viewer bringing things to it or seeing things in it that maybe even I didn't see. But
yeah,
I'm going to just stay on that for a second, because this sort of like, this juxtaposition against something that looks, at first glance perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you look at it and you realize it's not perfect, and you see some of the humanity in it, you see the person in it, you see the imperfections.
yeah.
How does that weave into it? Because your work has this sort of, it'll have an edge, and then also you'll lose the edge, and is that?
Yeah. Or if you
is that
look
effective?
close, it's not really this
Yeah.
type
Well,
of
I think this
edge
is
thing.
true of your work too,
Yeah.
because and then seeing videos that you post about working, I can kind of see this back and forth and the layering and the kind of,
Mhm.
it's a very complicated process that you're going through. But I don't know, I feel like I'm always, I definitely go into these things with a plan. There's like, not so much a vision of what it will be, but a plan. And I sort of lay things out, there's maybe a structure to it, and then I start working. I wrote a couple quotes down because they were like kind of important to me. So I wanted to, let's see. This one was from John Cage, and when I read it, I thought, yeah, exactly. So he said, all I know about method is that when I'm not working, I sometimes think I know something, but when I am working, it is quite clear that I know nothing. And I think that's kind of how I feel when I'm working, because it's just like you get lost in the thing and you're actually figuring it out as you go along. There wasn't, and it turns out, I would say it turns out very differently than I thought about it in the beginning, but I didn't really even have a clear idea of it in the beginning. I just had a structure or a framework or something that I kicked it off with, and then the rest was all kind of chance and decisions that I made along the way.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Like when I think about like art that I appreciate, one of the first things I think about is like, well, I can't do anything that I've seen, right? I don't want to like copy anybody else's work, so I have to figure out how to just translate the feelings or the ideas or whatever into my own version of that. And so, like, I look at a lot of impressionists. Like I looked at like Mary Cassatt a lot as I was doing these works. Impressionists have like big, chunky brush strokes and then thin ones, and they're always very loose and stuff. But you don't always see those until you zoom in, and maybe you see them in a gallery or something. And that's kind of one thing that I appreciate that I want to see in my own work is like some looseness. Like it's not meant to be this like super tight thing. Like I've tried taping things before, it doesn't look as good.
Right.
It doesn't look good when for what I'm trying to do, it doesn't look good when it's perfect. It looks better when it's imperfect.
Yeah, and which is amazing, because when I look at your paintings, I see that they're precise. The same way that I saw Mondrian when I was 17, but then I go up and look at them closely and I realize that that's not the way they are, that they,
Well,
that
people
they are
probably
layered.
say the same thing about yours, right? They're like, oh, it's incredible how you do that. But then when you look closely, it's just made up of more innocent marks. It's
tiny
not
little,
like
tiny little lines that,
the
that can
marks are
change in a minute. Yeah.
they're not like sacred,
No.
type things.
So, you mean your paintings at first, I mean, there's structure in these. And that, I think there's the big one out here. You've talked about your Mary Cassatt reference on that. When you look at her work, it just feels it's just so soft and pleasant and everything like that. But I've never really dissected one of her paintings, but I'm sure there's a ton of structure in there that she's figured out what her canvas is going to do and where things are going to be placed, and then she paints on top of that that structure, and then riffs off of that. Were you doing that with her piece here? Were you like looking at that and then going, okay, what is the sort of grid or structure underneath this painting? How do I repurpose that in a way?
Yeah, so I gravitated to her because one of the things that she's really known for is like capturing these moments of like, usually it's like a woman doing something interesting that maybe no male artist has ever done before, right? So she's holding her baby, or she's getting ready, she's getting ready in front of the mirror, or something like that. And so it was that idea behind the work of like looking closely at something where I gravitated to initially. And so what I did was I just looked closely at her work and started like diagramming it, tracing it, and sort of looking at it. And there's all these extra things that you appreciate when you start to notice all the little things that she gets right. And she's not the only artist of that era to do that, but like the nature of like what she was doing just really like sucked me in. And so I would take and kind of like trace the work and then adjust and adapt to it. And that would kind of be it wasn't a grid in the traditional sense, but that would kind of be like the structure, the skeleton of where like the core shapes would need to be. And then kind of like Roy said, then it starts to get kind of cagey and then you start to free up as you start to work. But it's nice, I guess this is where we come back to design. The Cassatt piece is like my brief. It's like my constraints. And it sort of gets me started on where to go. And then, once you're working, the art takes over a little bit, and you're saying, oh, I need to go this way with it because I'm not recreating the Cassatt work. I need to make my own piece, and now it's going in this different direction.
The creative brief is organic. That's an interesting way to think about it.
It's interesting you're talking about how you kind of taken the Cassatt painting and tried to figure it out structurally, compositionally, because it's like takes me back to my architecture education at MIT. We were constantly like taking buildings and trying to deconstruct them basically. Like we take a Frank Lloyd Wright or Le Corbusier made a building and do these kind of overlays and grid, try to figure out the grids and the organization of them, and then I don't know. I guess we were supposed to use that then to come up with something completely new, but But that's like it's like almost a scientific way of starting something.
It's kind of the designery side.
Yeah.
The technical or the sort of the rational. Like there's something in this image, and if I look closely at it enough, I'll find it. I'll find the secrets, and then I'll be able to reapply them to my projects.
And that'll be brilliant.
Yeah.
So looking around, Roy, you're moving into a new direction here. You're into these pieces here. So it's a shift in your body of work that is evolving over time. So I'm sort of curious about how that shift is happening for you, what you're trying to, where it's going for you.
Well, I've been doing mostly pen and ink for quite a while now, and that's been, the thing that has interested me. And it's like practical reasons, pen and ink is, I love pen and ink because of the simplicity of it. Like I use like a dip pen and a bottle of India ink, and lasts me several drawings, and there's like an economy to it and a sustainability about it. There's also some difficulty like in just like I said, getting older, eyes don't always focus quite as well as they used to. My hands, I'm afraid, someday I'm going to start getting the shakes or something, and I wanted to be able to kind of explore some other things, other ways that I could go. But, and beyond that, just because it's like there are a lot of other things you can do, and kind of want to do those, So I continue to do pen and ink work, but I kind of staggered it with other work like the powdered graphite stuff back there, which, I'm finding that to be, I wanted to, interestingly, I wanted to loosen up a little from pen and ink, and then I ended up doing these very structured, very precise kinds of things. But the actual application is just with my hand, and I just like rub the graphite in, and then sometimes I come back in with pencil and do some other textures, but it's a little more spontaneous, I suppose you'd say, and a little faster work, comes out faster. Then I think all of this is like kind of pushing me away from architecture, although I end up always kind of coming back to architecture too. But like, the crumpled paper and the roughness, the sculptural quality of it too. I'm also very much interested in sculpture, and I wish I could just kind of take the plunge into doing 3D stuff with the forms, but I haven't quite figured that out yet. Somebody was looking at the graphite pieces and saying, these look like sculpture to me. I was like, bless you. Because that's exactly what I want to hear. It's like I'm thinking sculpture, I think, a lot of times when I do that stuff. So this work, it's in progress. It's a lot of it's very new, and it's tied back into the pen and ink pieces that are here too. So, I'm not quite sure which of these things are going to mature into something, the next stages, and which ones will just be like kind of left behind. But exploration, always got to try some things that are what seem to me outside my comfort area, but when I look at them all together, I think, it makes sense to me. I mean, they all kind of belong together.
Where do you see your work evolving from here? Is it continue from here? Is it?
The thing that I always admire about other people's work that I'm chasing is like how to integrate more of greater variety of marks, like some textures. You can see some textures showing up, like on that one. I think they're pretty easy to see, and in other ones they're kind of hidden. I always just really appreciate that, because I think I guess for me it's kind of like it's like a good expression of like what the human experience is like. It's not just one paintbrush all over the canvas. There's all sorts of different variety of things happening. So I'm always kind of trying to chase like new textures and new kinds of marks, but there's still a gravitational force, because like they sort of come into a unified whole when you use that same mark over and over again. So I can tell there's something working here, but trying to just always bring some variety, so it's not the same painting over and over again.
Mm-hmm. So, is there like some theme, or like you think about your work like it is about this for it's sort of an overall theme. I mean, it's like some work is like man against nature, and and where it's an internal struggle you're trying to represent. Does your work have anything like that you're really just like, there's a psychological level here, there's a environmental level, there's a societal level of what I'm trying to do, and just wondering if you have thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the best way to talk about like the themes in this work that's on the walls here is that it's about like growth and relationships. Because for me, like I've always really been into like self-improvement and like how can I be better, whether it's like my health or my ideas or whatever that would be, and almost all this work was made after I got divorced. So I was thinking about it, I'm like, is the work about the divorce? No, it's not. It's about how I've been moving past, and like things like with my kids or with friends and all that stuff. It sort of shows up in the work in kind of a more of a subconscious way, like things that I've been thinking about as I'm doing pieces, and choosing Mary Cassatt, who's painting pictures of mothers and children, and all that kind of stuff is how it comes together. And so I hope it comes to life through like, all the marks and stuff to me are like the things that we do on a daily basis. They all kind of add up. right? They're all little actions or choices that we make. They come together, and that's kind of what life is. So that's kind of what I think about while I'm painting a lot of times.
Are you listening to anything while you're doing this, or are you,
Yeah.
you're in your head?
Yeah. No, I listen to. So sometimes I listen to music, and I listen to a radio. Like I have a radio station that I made. It's based off an artist named Maggie Rogers, and it just had the right feel to me for some reason. So I just kept going with it. And then sometimes I'll listen to audiobooks, and I listen to Margaret Atwood stuff. So Libby, like the audiobook app that the library has a ton of Margaret Atwood, so I've like burned through so much. And sometimes I'll just write down something from a song lyric or a from some essay or some book that she wrote. And sometimes those things end up as the titles, or sometimes they're notes on the backs of the paintings too. I just come back to, and you know, so it's got the right feel, you know.
How about you?
Yeah, I was gonna answer this question about, where this all comes from or whatever,
Thematic one.
thematically, yeah, differently, but then listening to Michael, when he was talking about how it came after your divorce, and it was like a kind of a period of, I guess, sort of reconstruction, maybe, or rethinking of what you were trying to do. And it reminded me that the series, so a lot of these drawings have this like designation of DWG after them. So, DWG1, which is basically just drawing one, was done in 2017, I think, early on. And, I kept producing. I didn't really know why I was doing them at the moment, but I produced several of them. And then I realized we were heading into a period of like incredible turmoil in our lives. And there was a lot of loss. Like, I'd lost grandparents before, I'd lost, distant relatives and so forth, but all of a sudden there were like people coming, we were losing people unexpectedly in a lot of different places in a lot of weird different ways. A friend of ours lost a 20-year-old daughter who was on a trip to Honduras over the holidays, and like she was doing like humanitarian work down there. And then, Sari's dad, who was in his 90s, and wasn't completely unexpected, but, still, it was a major loss. And a neighbor, an elderly neighbor who had kind of shepherded us into our neighborhood when we came, suddenly got very, very sick and died just within a very short period of time. My uncle was murdered. Anyway, a good friend died suddenly walking through Union Station in Washington, D.C. She just dropped dead. And then ultimately my mom passed away too. And so I realized that really these drawings, and it's like, normally my reaction to things like this would be to just kind of like, well, why am I doing this? This is kind of unnecessary thing that I'm doing. I'm not really inspired to do this. But I kind of, every time we would lose someone, I felt more motivated somehow to keep doing it. And so I finally ended up like labeling this series, starting with this DWG1, Lost and Found, because I realized that the work was the thing that was kind of propelling me through it to some extent. And along the way I would do these kind of little memorial pieces to the people who were going. And in fact, the piece here, kind of the Cosmos piece, is for Elsa, who was this elderly neighbor of ours. And anyway, that it became the purpose for my doing it, really. And I realized then the thing I guess I was gonna say, which goes back to my architecture education. I worked with my mentor at University of Illinois, was Henry Plummer, and he was this kind of, he was a very wise, sensitive kind of architect. And a quote from the book that has recently come out, which was basically the series of lectures and everything that he gave us in our studio. One of the most crucial, if overlooked, aspects of architecture is the capacity of buildings to either support or diminish the spontaneous powers of human beings to act in space. And I kind of realized that in a broader sense, beyond just architecture, this kind of was true of any kind of creative work that you produce, is that you really want to, you're not just putting it out there as a kind of a vanity for your own self, but you're hoping that other people will find some kind of a truth in it and some kind of a way of, being experiencing their own life in a different way as a result of it, that it opens up their capacity for free will and expression and discovery. And so those things are a lot about what my work is doing. I mean, I'm hoping that the pieces themselves are not the thing in the end, but that they add up to something, more about what life is about, what death is about, what the universe is about, all that. I mean, that sounds kind of, out there and maybe overly ambitious for an artist, but, that's what you're doing. Like the stuff has got to have that kind of gravity to it. I feel like otherwise, why would you bother to do it?
Yeah.
Well, you can't say I was just trying to make two rectangles look good
Right.
on this piece of paper
Yeah,
together.
right.
That won't sustain you for years and years.
No.
That'll only sustain you for a day.
That's right.
So we talked earlier on about how your professional lives have influenced your artistic lives. Is there an inverse? Does your artistic life influence your professional work? And if so, how might that happen? I know you're maybe you're not practicing as much as you used to,
Right.
and you're still in the midst of your career and it's morphine.
Yeah.
But you're both exploring these things, and I really appreciate your sharing what you just shared with us, because I think much of us are creating out of that space, and it's always I'm always grateful to hear people share that, because it helps you get involved in the artwork in a different way and feel connected to it. So thank you for that. But going back and now does that get reverse engineered, and how do you bring it back into it? And is that going back to issues of for you're doing consumer work, so that's all about listening to other people,
Yeah.
and trying to determine what it is they need to buy the products they're selling. So it's while it's very commercial, it's also extremely empathetic in a way.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's interesting that happens, I don't know how you feel about this, but for some reason I naturally have this sort of division between art and design a lot of times. When I'm doing art at home, I'll do certain things a certain way, and then when I'm doing something professionally, there's another set of processes and practices that we use to do that work, right? And there's sort of a right way, not a right way, but like a generally, accepted way to do things. And it's only when I sometimes get into some sort of conflict or challenge or whatever that I sort of get to remember that I can switch them up and use them against each other, or use them for each other or whatever. So it's we do a lot of research on consumers and users, and I work on a lot of digital products now, so a lot of it has to do with here's an app. Do people understand what they should do to use this app properly? And that's work, right? But then sometimes when I get home, I'm like, oh, if I research what I'm gonna paint before I paint it, it's better work, And so it applies across like that really well. But I do have to kind of consciously remind myself to use those two worlds together, and not just kind of have a day job and have a side of have an art thing at night or whatever. And sometimes if I'm at work and things are stuck, right? We're arguing about how we should do something or whatever. Sometimes you can use a little creative analogy or something from way out in left field. I don't know, I've never used a Mary Cassatt painting at work before, but I can just be oh, this is we should do this the way Picasso would do it or something. I mean, it totally will change people's perspectives and get them to see things in a different way, which is pretty important in business sometimes when you're just kind of jammed up.
And I think that's what I mean when I said I feel like the world is more open to that now. I mean, I think, 30 years ago, if I had brought up Picasso in a design meeting, granted, I worked in a museum lighting consultancy then, and so art was kind of a part of what we worked with, so there was a certain appreciation of it at least. But I think a lot of business people or marketing people or whatever might have been very not open to that.
They wouldn't even know what you meant. Probably.
Whereas now I feel well, that's cool. Never thought about using Picasso or Mary Cassatt or whatever. I'll kind of answer that question too, because I feel like I'm coming from the other side, and I brought this today, which I had a period where I was working for Rookwood Pottery. I had a relationship with them for about 7 or 8 years, from 2007 till whenever. And one of the things I got to do was to design this trophy, and if there are any tennis fans here, I don't know, this is the trophy for the Western and Southern tournament. And so that was kind of my swan song. Well, not really my swan song. It happened early on, but it was maybe the highlight of my working relationship with them. And it's an interesting thing because it really was almost the perfect marriage of art and design. I mean, the drawings for it and all that were purely my own, but from the minute we started talking about production, it became a kind of collaborative process. And so I didn't do the sculpture work. We had a sculptor, Gary Simon, who has done a lot of the sculpture work for Rookwood. And so I did the acanthus leaves. Acanthus leaves represent victory and all that from the Athenian days. And the client immediately was like, oh, we have to have some reference to tennis. So we stuck the tennis ball berries or whatever in there. So already the collaboration has begun. The input has begun.
Mm-hmm.
But, so the thing really took shape because of the sculptor, the glazed artist who worked out how we would actually put the colors on there and all that. But, I mean, it was a cool process.
Yeah.
And I got to be the artistic director, I guess you would say. It was like my vision. I led the thing through the process. And they come back to me some years later and they said, well, we want to add a bunch of sponsorship things and stuff on it. Will you design that for us? And I said, no, I won't do that. So, if you're going to do it, but I'm not going to be the one. I'm not going to be the one who does that. So I think you can see it today being held up by Djokovic or somebody. It's got like some logos and stuff like that on it.
Yeah.
But anyway, I got to get one of the. So they produced about 8 of them in the original run, because you never know if there's going to be some breakage. You want to have a couple different glaze options to choose from. I always wrote it in my contract with Rookwood that I would get a piece of whatever I had designed. So it was a tile or a mug or whatever. So I just left that phrase, that clause in the contract. And I said, oh yeah, by the way, I'm going to get one of these. And they said, what? I said, it's in the contract. So it happened that not too many of them broke in the kiln or anything, so they had a couple extras. So I got to keep one. But, and one of my favorite details is and this wasn't me, this was the sculptor who came up with this. He said, what if we took one of the acanthus leaves and wrapped it over the top? And that's something I didn't think of, and collaboration sometimes works. But I wanted the thing to be really heavy, because I wanted an athlete holding it to look athletic holding it, not that they were holding a little lightweight piece of whatever. And I also wanted the handles on the bottom so they could hold it above their heads. So anyway, that's one of my proudest accomplishments as a designer.
That's a good one.
So, obviously, I had a sense that your work would dialogue with one another, but I'm curious as now that, really sort of knew each other, but not really a whole lot until we got to work in the gallery together. Since it's been up together, sort of curious about how you think your work relates to one another, and if you do think it does, and how you think it does, and what those relationships are, because I thought that's a really strong aspect of this show.
Well, I think one of the things that's a fun story is when we were first hanging the show in the front there, there's a couple pieces next to each other that, immediately we kind of saw the fun, I think you called it a fractal, because basically it's the same thing happening at very different scales, right? So there's a piece, there's a couple pieces up there. Mine's kind of a blue and green thing, and yours is one of the ink drawings. And it's like if you look really closely at yours, there's these little like moving, sort of swirling strokes. And then if you look at mine, it's basically the same thing. I just got like a 1/2-inch brush that I'm doing it with. And I just think that's really, really interesting. I mean, I don't know what to make of it. It's just, I guess it's great when you can walk through and not see things until you examine them more closely.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't know each other until a few months ago when Paul was putting us together for the show, so we've kind of, gotten familiar. And what's really a rare thing for me is to just kind of relinquish control of something to someone. And when Paul said, "Oh, I have this vision for this show," and I was like, "Go for it, let's do it. Do you think they're going to work together? Let's do it." And even when we were installing a couple weeks ago, I just kind of, like I said, I come from an exhibit design background and an art exhibits background, and it's very easy for me to say, "Oh, no, don't put that there. And then as an artist as well, well, I don't want that piece next to that piece, But I just tried to stand back and I let Paul kind of run with it. And so in a way, the show is his his sculptures are here too, and it's kind of his creative vision of what our work together would look like. And there's something that's a very design thing, to collaborate and to let somebody do the thing that they do and be the curator and be the kind of organizer. And but I love Michael's work, and since I've gotten to see the pieces in person, I've kind of loved them even more because they do exactly what I think I want my work to do, which is to coax people into them. You look at them from afar, you see a certain composition, you see a certain palette of colors. You go closer, you realize there's so much more going on there than you realized from a distance. And I love that about his paintings, and I hope that's what my pieces are doing for people as well. So
you get the levels, like that one. That one from here just looks like a big black rectangle.
Yeah.
But I know as I get closer, you'll see subdivisions, and then if you get even closer, you see the textures inside of all of it.
Yeah, I love that because it's sort of this micro macro thing that's happening at multiple levels, and one of the things that you look at certain paintings, and I love that expression, like, oh, look at this moment right here. You do it in architecture too. You're walking through a hallway and there's a window that lines perfectly up with a stairwell, and you're like, oh my God, this is like a perfect moment that's happening. And I think both of these bodies of work have that in there at sort of the overall effect, but then you get in this piece here. I think there's the color combinations of that blue and that orange, where they're just like right there, and they just have this vibrancy that doesn't overpower the piece, but brings you in, and as you look around the canvas, those moments are happening, and that I think is really exciting when you're really spending the time with a piece of art. So the question is, I guess, is how do you know when you're done?
I was going to ask that. How do you know when to stop?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
You go.
I just know, but I think my idea of when something is done. I remember in like the junior high and high school art class, I always had the art teachers always coming up and saying, "Oh, careful! Don't overwork it. Don't go too far."
Yeah.
And I don't worry about that anymore. When you're working with, especially with black and white, and if you're going for black, then I push it as far as I can usually. And I don't know. There's just a moment I just know. I can work on it, and then I'm like, oh, it should be done. But then I look at it, it's like, no, that's not done. Another 15 or 20 minutes later, no, it's still not quite done. And sometimes you put it away and take it out, whatever, and you just know. I don't know when there's nothing more. It's not going to go any further than that.
Yeah. I think for me, what happens is when you step away from the piece or kind of lean, you take a break or you step back from it a little bit. I don't really want any of the individual marks to sort of stand out on their own. I kind of want them all to work together as a whole. And a lot of times, imagine when I first get started, it's just maybe a dozen lines on the canvas. That's far from being done, right? But as you layer more and more up, you start to notice this is starting to work as like a group, and it's a little form that kind of starts to emerge, or maybe it's still a line that kind of lives on its own, but it does a good thing for the composition and moves it all around. So when I can step back and not really see any one line jumping out to me anymore, that's when I know it's done, because to me that's kind of what I'm going for.
I would agree with that. Those lines that nobody else will see them, but you see them, and it's just not quite there yet.
Yeah.
It's like a little out of balance, or it's a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily, I don't think about this while I'm doing the work, but I think I really stress over the composition, right? You step back and like, something needs to be counterbalancing this form over here. I need to add something, and then kind of wrestling with it. Or, I don't know, it's not really a wrestling match, but you know, I flip the canvas upside down all the time and look at it from different angles, and you see different things and stuff. And
Do you ever end up like changing the orientation of the painting?
Yeah,
like
yeah,
after it's almost done, you kind of say, oh wait, it goes the other way.
that one, and then there's one in the front too that I flipped over, and I'm like, it's just better this way. And then I finish it that way.
Yeah.
Oh.
Cool.
So I'm curious, does anybody have any questions or observations?
Yes, well, it's interesting. You mentioned you were looking at Mondrian's paintings close up, and that I suspect that the original audience, when they first saw these in the 20s, they said, "Oh, this is like art of the machine age."
Right.
But and when you notice these imperfections, we're living in a totally different era. We're living in a digital age, which is so much of what we look at is digitally produced as that like hard edge.
Yeah.
We're not. Even back then, the machines were analog.
Yeah.
So, and when you mentioned the iPhone earlier on, I think there was this YouTube video where a fellow was looking at a catalog from the 1990s, Radio Shack, and his most memorable sentence was, 75% of the things in here were replaced by the iPhone.
Yeah.
But
Really
to get back to Mondrian, when I look at your paintings, I look up close and notice this, sometimes this like stipple fill, and it says to me, oh, this is something with the 2020s sensibility. This is not intended to be a reconstruction of the 1920s.
No.
This is we're actually in the present day here.
Well, like I said, I've always wanted it to look handmade. I've never been striving for any kind of like, digital printout look or anything like that. And there's so many more things going into the work than what we're able to kind of hit on today. But I mean, so light, I didn't really talk about light today, which is kind of another thing along with drawing is like a theme that kind of runs through everything I do. And so it's always, so when you have like the Mondrian grids of lines and stuff, they're always done by building up. It's a building up process. It's like what you do. It's like there's layers of stuff, and there's always light coming. It's not a black line. It's like a line with light coming through it. There's always light. There's always some, aspect of that. And the graphite pieces, there's always light that seems to be radiating from behind them, even if the thing is almost solid graphite. There's always a little bit of light coming through. So that's the kind of human part of this all that I'm looking for. Is like, I'm not trying to get at some absolute, because that doesn't interest me.
Do you tape it off?
I don't tape off on the ink drawings. The ink drawings are all done. I do use like a felt tip pen to get the edges, and then just the dip pen for all the line, for all the texture work. I tape off for the graphite pieces. That's how I get that, because I'm using my finger as as the tool, and you couldn't do that otherwise. But even there's a lot of variation, in the edges. Sometimes the white comes all the way into the piece and all that. So, yeah, I mean, it's not that I don't believe in getting hard edges. It's just that if you do have the hard edges, then I want to work backwards from that, to get it more human, more man-made looking, if you will.
I always wondered if Mondrian used tape, and you're saying not. But I did see something, like a documentary, I guess, and his assistant was still living. This documentary was pretty old. And she said, oh, he was really hampered by, during World War II, when he couldn't get tape, there was like shortages.
Yeah.
And I had the idea that, did you see that too?
No, but
I'm thinking maybe, I always wondered, was that just because he was getting so old?
He might
at that
have
time?
used, well, no, he might have taped. His lines are pretty straight, but even with, if he was doing an underlay with tape, you could definitely see where there are brush strokes on top of that have edges and irregularities, and you can.
Yeah.
It's not like you can see like where the tape was then peeled up and the brush stroke got interrupted.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I should probably look into his process a little bit more, because I think that you're raising questions that I'm curious about. I'm only basing mine on what I see when I look at the pages.
Yeah, well, I saw some I was looking at closely in Toledo, and I'm thinking like you, this doesn't look taped.
But I mean, I'm looking at Michael's pieces, and I think they almost look like they could have had some kind of masking, even though those curves would be held to mask. But I mean, I've watched your work, I've watched your videos. You can see him making those strokes, and they're very clean edge to them. Although then they begin to kind of taper out, feather out on the edges and on the ends and everything. So it's kind of the same thing. I think you're looking for that kind of precision, but not that looks like it was made by a machine.
Yeah.
Beverly.
The question is actually for you. How did you, first of all, come up with this idea? And then how, with all the artists around, how did you find two people who work together so well? Their art independently works so well together. Did you have to interview others who didn't pass the test or something?
Well, thanks for the question.
Can I I curated one show once before, and I thought it was gonna be so easy. Well, I didn't really think it was gonna be so easy, but I was really surprised by how difficult it was. So this is a great question, because it's when you walk in and you see work on the wall, you don't really think too much about how it got there.
Yeah.
Fair and place to ask.
Well, I mean, I think I met both of these guys here. Roy came in early on when I opened up the gallery, and was introduced to me by a mutual friend. And we got together for coffee and started meeting, and I got to see his work, and I've always been really intrigued with it for all the reasons he's talking about, and the reason why the show exists, because he really has this the sensibility of really trying to use, that I think there's a struggle in between the art and design, as well as, it can be a battle, because as an artist, you're sort of wanting, speaking personally, sometimes I'm wanting to lose that aspect of myself and not feel that constraint about trying to know what it is I'm doing. But, there's also this elastic band that just goes, okay, I put that line down, and I go, it's not really right. I have to rethink of it. If I'm going to make a decision, I got to think about the decision. And that's how you're trained as a designer. And you want to sort of lose that. But, and I saw that in his work, that there was, that struggles in there, and that sensibility of both of those coming through. And I knew very early on I wanted to show his work. And then Michael I met here at the gallery as well, and likewise I started following him, and then we got together and I saw his work, and I was just like, okay, there's just something here. These guys are attempting to do the same thing. And so it's really sort of like the first time I've curated a show that's specifically intended to have the work speak to one another. The previous show, the IAI show, was a curated show, but it was just curated through a technology more than it was about the artwork. So this is very much specifically like this. The next show is also a curated show that uses two artists. I don't know if you know Mark Weisner and Cynthia Lockhart. Mark works in corrugated cardboard, and Cynthia works and she's a fabric designer and artist. So they're both working in fiber, which I find interesting. Their expression for their choice of fiber is radically different from one another, but there is a thread there between the two of them, pardon the pun, that I think really will unify their work in this way. So it's sort of fun to start thinking about that, because I sort of think about this as, it's sort of performance art in some way. You know, how do we get people in here? How do we get people interacting with it, talking about it, you know, expressing their feelings about it? All that involves the community, involves the artists involved, and I get to be the artistic director of that, like you were with your trophy, which is sort of a thrill to be able to do that. And, you know, when I look at this and this is, I think, my 14th or 15th show in a couple years, and I'm so often struck by how honored I feel that people want to show here, and you know, will you know, sort of give me the honor of putting their beautiful work up here in this gallery, and sometimes I'm just like, oh my God, what a cool thing that is to have this quality of work in here, and sort of this consistent quality, and in this case, it's sort of blending of two artists who really their work speak together. So it feels like an honor, you know, to be able to do that. So, yes, Gail.
So I was taking notes. I think it's so interesting that both of you said that the more technological your work, your profession got, the more you were sort of pushed to go back to the handwork. And I missed the last show about AI, but there's been a lot of talk about how is that going to change the way people do things. And in my world, which is food, the same thing has happened, right? The more technological, the more processed the food is. You can order boxes where everything is already cut up for you.
Yeah.
There's a huge pushback on raising their own bees and doing their own sprouts and sourdough starters and doing everything from scratch the old way. And it talks to also a conversation that I've been having with our oldest for 15 years that is about the intersection between art and craft, which is different than the intersection between art and design, but sort of connected, and you know, gives me the same headache when I think about it a little bit. And so I wanted to ask about art and about craft as well, because the way you do these brushstrokes all at once creates this that reminds me of the paint chip samples at Home Depot. Is that a terrible thing to say?
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Because they're like the gradations of the colors.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what it reminds me of.
Yeah.
But that's not the way it was crafted.
Sure. I mean, I think when I think about technology, there was something that we used to say at an old job all the time. We would do sort of like research and strategy for other businesses. And people get so obsessed about a technology, but there's always one. Masking tape was a technology way back when, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now we take it for granted, like glasses are a technology, right? I've heard people say we're all cyborgs, we've all had glasses forever.
Yeah.
And we would always say, you know, technology is just a driver, it's an enabler of something else in the human, I don't know, a trend or whatever. It's a human value or a belief or something that becomes popular or whatever. It's going to be enabled by technology or changed by technology, but it's not, technology isn't the trend in and of itself. So I always sort of think about that too, of like, okay, this AI stuff is interesting, I'm playing around with it, I don't know how it's going to end up in my work yet, but I want to know something about it because it could give me new ideas or whatever. So I kind of think of them as like just a tool, and I try to sort of accept all the technologies and then just kind of see what happens, right? So like I'm doing a lot of stuff on my iPad these days to prepare drawings and things like that, and those 3 pieces are digital. So you know, I'm kind of, I just always remind myself, like, technology is a tool, and the reason it's getting popular is because there's something in the psyche that is important to people, right? Or maybe sometimes they don't know why it's important yet, but it's like coming, and then people are starting to they have a relationship with the technology because it's a better way of explaining something that they can't put to words yet.
Yeah, I think, you know, we had a lot of discussion about this in the AI show, and it just went on and on about, you know, what is this? Is this art or
You should
not?
plug your YouTube channel, right?
Yeah. Sign up for my YouTube channel. Watch the videos.
Videos on there.
Is it on there?
Yeah.
Oh, I
Yeah.
got it here.
Yeah.
There's 2 talks. There's an artist talk with 3 of the out-of-town artists, and then there's a panel discussion with a lawyer talking about IP issues. So they're both good videos. But and there's there's a really nice piece that Cincinnati Lifestyle did. It was a 7-minute piece they did on the show where they interviewed all the artists in the show, which is up on the website. But you know, I think we kept netting out is like AI is, you know, it's a tool to make art, you know, but so is a paintbrush, you know, so is a camera, so is a pen that you write with. So all these things are tools that we're using and how we're going to be using them. But I will get back to your point, because this is my personal belief is I think AI will make this stuff, handmade stuff, that much more valuable. That might be my wish, because you know, I'm on my computer doing work all the time. The last thing I really want to do when I'm making art is be on my computer. I want to be getting dirty and using my analog skills to do that. I will use the technology along the way. I'll photograph the work, I'll bring it into Photoshop. I'm like, what if it should be this color? What if it needs to be longer? What if it needs to be wider? And then I'll bring that knowledge back to my analog world. So it's a give and take the use of technology. I even think, you know, with some of the AI stuff, it's really interesting is I've taken my sculptures and you can bring it in and have it describe it to you. And then you can use that description to then go somewhere else. And I've only done this a little bit, but you know what it did was it all of a sudden introduced me a whole new flock of sculptors, because it's now saying, well, this is in the style of, you know, so-and-so. I'm like, I have no idea who that is. And then you can go, okay, who's that guy? And it opens up your world. So I think it's a conduit to something else. And I think in that respect, it's really exciting. But ultimately, my hope is that it makes analog work that much more
I have to
valuable.
say, when you did the AI show, and then I knew our show was coming right after that, I found it a really jarring juxtaposition for me. And I don't want to, I mean, I know I'm going to be the contrarian here, because I always am.
Yeah.
But like the thing I always worry about when I hear things about technology being just a tool is like, well, you know, at what point is the tool more important than the person using the tool? And so I'm going back, I just was glancing at this quote from my mentor, my professor, saying about architecture, but it says, the capacity of buildings, art, whatever, to either support or diminish the spontaneous powers of human beings to act. And I think, I mean, that's the question that is being raised, I feel like, by this technological revolution that's going on around us. And Paul says, well, he thinks that'll make our art more valuable, or more important, or whatever. I don't know. I mean, it's like, we all look at like 19th century buildings and we admire the beautiful masonry work on them and the stone carvings and everything, but nobody does that anymore. There's no market for that anymore. There's nobody who's going to do that because it's been devalued, you know, to the point that, you know, there's nobody's, either the people that are doing it, you can't afford to hire them, or they just don't exist.
Yeah, it's almost like they haven't been devalued, they've been upvalued.
Yeah, but in that sense, they've been outmarketed. You know, there's no longer a market for it because they're too precious or too expensive or whatever. And you know, that's what worries me. I won't be here in a century when all of this has, you know, maybe none of us will. I don't know, but you know, when we're like into the next wave or 2 waves from now, and nobody's even having this conversation anymore. But you know, I like thinking of what you were saying about food and how the food arrives already cut up and everything. And it's like, my professor would say that act of cutting that food up is a human act that engages you with your food and the process of making the food.
That is removed when you...
That you no longer are part of anymore. You're just, you know, the same way we don't slaughter cows anymore ourselves. We rely on, you know, someone else to do that, and it's easy to, and someone else fixes the beef and we just eat the hamburger.
Yeah.
But, you know, so things change. There's technologies that are going to come. We're going to have to live with them. I just hope that we can hang on to a few of the things that, like I said, define us and define us as individuals and people who can make decisions for ourselves and find meaning for ourselves, that we don't have to rely on machines to do that for us. So, I don't know, that's my...
I think that when you can see the technology at play, like you don't, it's usually not as good as when it's just sort of there helping achieve whatever the goal was in the first place.
Yeah.
Right, so like when someone uses AI, right, to create an image, you can tell it was created with AI. That's kind of like, okay, it's cool, but it doesn't get you to that level of, I think, what most art is striving for, which is a little bit a higher level of engagement. And so the technology, and I'm thinking about it right now with a brush stroke. I'm like, oh, should you not be able to see the brush strokes differently? And what can I go back to the studio and play around with that? Because that's a technology too. But yeah, like as soon as you see the technology, you're not getting. That's kind of like blocking you from maybe a better experience that's between you. It's between you and the technology, maybe.
Any other questions? Should run over our time frame. It's been a great discussion. Thanks everybody for being here.
Yeah,
And,
thanks.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
welcome to hang out for a while. I'll be here till 4. Great, thank you.